Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Joining us now from our Abuja studios is Clement Nwankwo, human rights lawyer, director at Policy and Legal Advocacy Center and convener of Nigeria's civil society organization Situation Room, one of the 116 domestic observers approved by INEC for the 2019 general elections. Welcome to the morning show.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Nwankwo, 70 civil society organizations joined forces in 2010 to establish the Situation Room in the approach to the 2011 general elections. So this is coming up to your third general elections. Can you give us a comparative analysis in the trends that you have seen, progress that has been made, and areas that still need improvement?
Thank you. Since 2010, the Civil Society Situation Room has been functioning, and this would be the third election, yes. When we look at the events around the elections in 2011, we did see a lot of anxiety. This was in the period that the former president, Umaru Yar'Adua, had died. And the vice president had taken over and was now running elections to succeed him in an atmosphere where it was felt that there was a zoning system in place and that the acting president, who was later named president, was breaching that. So the tension was high. The main challenger was from the northern part, and the incumbent then was from the southern part of the country. So the tension was high. The issue of violence was really on the front burner. And so the major contention in 2011, the major issue was the fear of violence. And of course, we did see a lot of violence that resulted from that. And that even led to a government committee that was set up, the LAMO committee, that had a report looking at the massive levels of violence that took place in 2011. So it was a challenging time. In 2015, it was again a contest between the same actors, essentially. But this time, I think that you had a president who was very concerned about having a peaceful election, but he also had, in 2015, a much more improved electoral commission. So for a lot of people in 2015, there had been, of course, the concerns, but really it was supposed to be the moment that an improved electoral commission was supposed to deliver on the improvements and changes that had taken place in the commission. And we did see a generally peaceful elections in 2015. And we did see, for the first time in Nigeria's history, a transition of power from an incumbent to a challenger. It was the first time in this country that an opposition party was winning the general elections. And we did see the current government take office in 2015. As we speak today, some of the challenges from the previous two elections are very, very manifest. The challenges of violence are staring one in the face. But the added problem with the 2019 elections, which gives everybody serious cause for concern, is the levels of desperation on both sides. It wasn't as bad as this in 2015. It wasn't bad in 2011. In 2019, it's much worse, and it's really given a lot of concern. Added to that is what appears to be an increasing stake, rising stake by institutions of states in the outcome of elections, and that's what worries everybody. State institutions are taking an active interest in these elections in ways that go beyond their responsibilities and functions. And a lot of people are concerned about partisanship of state institutions, and by state institutions I refer to security services, the police, the army, and other agencies of states. This is very, very worrying as we speak. And as we speak right now, the army, for instance, has what it calls Operation Python Dance. And if you look around the country, it's deploying all over the country. This is a major, major concern as we look towards elections in just about 2 weeks. And for us in civil society who are observing the elections, for the international community and the international observers, it is a major focus as we head towards the 2019 elections. What would be the role of the security services? We do have a new Inspector General of Police. He has said the very right things. His demeanor, his courage appears to give some bit of return of confidence about the police doing the right thing. And we're keeping an eye to ensure that we are able to report properly the kind of role that the police play. We have to see what role the army plays because they are deploying across the country. We have no information on the purpose of the deployment. We have no information on why they are deploying so very massively across the country. This is a role that has not been played previously, and I think that for everyone who is worried about the elections, who would like to see a free and fair election, the hope is that the army, the police, recognizes that Section 29, subsection 3 of the Electoral Act gives the Electoral Commission the powers, responsibility, and duties of outlining what role the security forces should play in elections. And any other thing outside of that role would be really a threat to the conduct of free, fair, and credible elections in Nigeria.
You made reference to a level of desperation among some stakeholders. Can you clarify who is exhibiting the levels of desperation and how?
I think it cuts across board. If you go back to the primaries of the political parties, you would see that virtually across all of the political parties, very little compliance was made with respect to the provisions of the Electoral Act for the conduct of primaries. So across the parties, the primaries were very, very badly conducted. And the desperations began to manifest from that point. But you also see the campaigns, you see the language used, you see the opposition parties issuing threats, you see the incumbent government twisting, apparently, institutions of state. These are issues that are very worrying, and those are levels of desperation that we are talking about. And we emphasize the point that the opposition needs to understand that they will bear responsibility for violence. The incumbent party needs to know that it will bear the responsibility for violence, but also bear responsibility for achieving abuse of state institutions for electoral gains.
Mr. Nwankwo, so what is, for the benefit of our viewers, what is the role of the Nigerian civil society as monitors for the general elections?
We are observers, and there are several, like you mentioned, 100 and something organizations who are going to be observing these elections. We even have some state institutions that will be observing the elections. Everyone will be deploying across. There are organizations, not necessarily even in Situation Room, who are deploying across the country. Virtually every polling unit of the country, 119,973 polling units in this country, which is approximately 120,000 polling units, will be observed by observers across the country. The ward collation process would be something that would be followed very closely. So civil society is going to observe the elections. We're going to come up with reports on what we see. But we're also saying to Nigerians, and we will be doing so as civil society as well, if you are in polling units, there is what is called a Form EC60A that is pasted on the walls or in a public place in the polling units, indicating the results of the polling units. We are asking people to take evidence of this, take pictures of this. We are asking political parties, all political parties, to create what is their own situation room so that they can take evidences from the polling units, do the collation, and cross-check against what the Electoral Commission is putting out. Because at the end of the day, you are going to need that evidence. Political parties have up till February the 1st, I think it's tomorrow, to submit names of their polling agents. everybody aspiring to run for election to whatever position, whether it is president or governor or legislative elections, should ensure that they have agents in all of the polling units where their constituencies are, to ensure that they have evidences. In the past, a lot of people went to elections almost blindfolded without even bothering to get evidence. Given the levels of desperation, we're saying to parties, train your agents, put in trusted agents, get evidence of what it is that has happened at the polling units. Civil society groups will be doing this as well, and will be using that to cross-check and validate or judge the credibility of the elections or not.
All right, I see that the Nigerian civil society, the Situation Room, has set out some conditions in which INEC security agents and political parties must fulfill. And one of those conditions was the need for an audit of the PVCs, of the Permanent Voters Card. Do you think that INEC has made provisions for this condition? Especially the fact that some political parties or politicians, the public concern is that they are buying PVCs.
Well, we have seen and have made inputs into the guidelines issued by INEC for the conduct of the elections. Part of the provisions in that guideline is for the use of the permanent voters card, and where there are challenges with the PVCs being read, or the fingerprints biometrics of the voter being read, there are provisions in the guidelines to deal with this. And when we mention audits of the card readers, we had said that if there is a 5% failure in the use of the card readers in any of the elections, INEC should immediately conduct an audit to confirm and verify that this is not sabotage of its process. INEC has said that the whole issue of incident forms will not apply, but they have come up with an alternative that if somebody's biometrics cannot be read and the person's name is on the voters register, they would be allowed to vote on achievement of certain conditions, which includes that they thumbprint on a corner by their name and include their phone numbers. We have said, and INEC has implemented this change in its guideline, that this should not happen to prevent abuse unless the agents of all of the parties and observers at the polling units agree that this is the case. So I think that there is citizens' responsibility to ensure that reports from the past where several millions of people were able to vote simply by filling out incident forms that nobody really goes back to check should not happen with these elections.
Indeed, talking about guidelines now, 61 political parties have threatened to drag INEC to court over the released guidelines. Does your group share in concerns over the guidelines?
We know that some of the political parties had expressed concern about certain aspects of the guidelines, or especially the issue relating to simultaneous accreditation and voting. The Civil Society Situation Room has a view that the introduction of simultaneous accreditation and voting is a practice that has been on, especially in the last 2 years, and this has been used in elections, in governorship elections in Edo, in Ondo, in Anambra, in Osun, in Ekiti, and it's proved really successful. Part of the challenge we had with the previous case, where you had a band of time for accreditation and then a band of time for voting, was that when people were accredited, if, for instance, you had 200 people registered in a polling unit and you accredit 150 only for that election, when the people actually come back at 12 o'clock to come and cast their votes, there would be a gap, and sometimes a lot of them don't come back. And if there are 50 people that don't come back, we found that the abuse had been that ballot papers are thumbprinted to match and complete the numbers of those that were initially accredited. And this was creating big problems for the elections. And so when INEC introduced this, it was actually with encouragement from civil society who had been observing the election. So it wasn't entirely an INEC initiative. It was coming from reports from observers who had been across the different governorship elections and who had also observed the 2015 general elections and made recommendations. So this is nothing that is or was specifically designed for the 2019 elections, and we do not find any reason to question INEC's guideline regarding simultaneous accreditation and voting.
Well, you've raised concerns about military exercises going on in the country. Indeed, we do know that by electoral law, the police is empowered to secure the voting process. But we have also seen the federal government in the space of two weeks raise the alarm twice about security threat going into the elections. Don't you think that extra measures with security should be taken? And let me also ask you, because you've been interacting with INEC a lot, what, in your opinion, is the biggest challenge INEC is facing going into this election?
I think INEC can speak about its challenge. We can speak from observing what is going on in terms of the preparations, including the briefings that INEC has given on its preparations. Regarding alarm raised by government officials, I know that the Minister of Information, Lai Mohammed, did raise an alarm. I was a bit shocked by the details of the alarm, and I know that the National Security Advisor did meet a couple of days ago with some governors or governors of the states to discuss security around the elections. Now, we believe that the government of the Federation does have a responsibility to ensure a conducive security environment for elections. I think that and the government may have more information than we do have, so we do not expect that the government will fail to exercise responsibility to provide for security across the country. What we are concerned about is a nationwide security operation that will appear to frighten voters, that will pose the challenge whether the security services will steer away from interfering in the electoral process. If the security services are deploying in routine provision of security around the country, this is very welcome. That's what they should do. If they are going to in any way be involved on election day with security or deployment of security, this must be in compliance with the Electoral Act. Section 29, subsection 3 is very clear that the security services can only be deployed in line with a template devised by INEC. We have been asking INEC to share this template with us and also publicly. So I think there's a distinction between deploying for the elections and as well generally providing security. And we have no problem with the security services providing security around the country generally. But I think the major concern would be how that impacts on the elections and whether they do deploy for election purposes. And were they to do so, there would be questions as to whether this impacts on the outcome of the elections. I think I must make the point as well that every political party running for election needs to understand that it is important that they win the election credibly. Any party winning election in an illegitimate way, in a way that raises concerns about the legitimacy of elections, will be acquiring a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory means that you may be announced as winner, you will be illegitimate, and the world will engage with you only as an illegitimate government. And this country went through an illegitimate government in the past, almost 20 years now, and have come a long way since democracy. We do not, and I don't think anybody who loves this country would love to see us return to the days or when Nigeria was an outcast in the international community. An election that fails the test of legitimacy or credibility will return us to that, and we have to avoid it.
Now, you condemned the suspension of the Chief Justice of Nigeria and called on the National Assembly to reconvene and provide a legislative response. The Senate suspended plans to reconvene and approach the Supreme Court. Are you satisfied with this approach?
No, I think that the Senate, it's quite clear that the Senate needs to take that decision in plenary. If the Senate has indicated that it intends to approach the Supreme Court, we expect that this would be a discussion in plenary and it will be a decision taken by the Senate in plenary. That's what the procedure would be, and we expect to see the Senate discuss that when it reconvenes. We did see reported in the media some of the shenanigans that were beginning to play out. I have no evidence for what was put out in the media, but we did see that there were concerns that the sitting of the Senate, if it did reconvene earlier this week as it planned, would have been a rancorous and perhaps even unproductive one. So it's understandable that unfortunately the Senate could not reconvene in plenary. And I think that that's part of the challenge that we're faced with in this country today. The levels of division, even in institutions of state, is incredibly high. And this country needs to come back to unity, come back to a system that sees Nigerians united in common purpose, in search for development. I think it's very sad that most of the conversations that this country is having today is not about development, it's not about a new search for development, it's not about how to improve conditions of living of people. It's mostly about how to hold on to power, how to gain power, how to use power, how to abuse power. Very sad for this country at this time of our development, or indeed, I would say non-development.
Okay, so what do you think that the CGN's options are at this point? And do you think that, you know, what are his chances to clear his name at the CCT, given that he has admitted to false asset declaration?
My preference at this time would be really to discuss less of the issue, but because there's a lot of processes going on, the CJN has processes to follow. His lawyers are in court working with him to deal with the issues, and I think we would see and should see how that runs its course. I think that in condemning the suspension of the CJN, we believe that it sends a very wrong signal. Nigeria is a major player in the African continent. We did send soldiers to Sierra Leone to intervene recently. This administration sent soldiers, sent warship to Sierra Leone to ensure that to Gambia even, to ensure that democracy was respected. We have defended democracy, especially in West Africa, in the continent. We should show example. When you threaten the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary, you're sending a bad signal across the world. And it's not just about elections, bad signal. It's really about the economy, about development. You are telling people, Nigerians, you're going around the world telling people that Nigeria is a place for you to invest in. You're telling investors that you can sack for whatever reason. And I'm not looking, there might actually be plausible reasons why the CJN should not be in office, but that's has its own procedures to deal with. When you tell the world that you don't care about your processes, you don't care about your constitution, then it would take I would even say a masochist to come to your economy to come and invest. It would take someone who does not love himself or who is a gambler to come into your economy to come and invest, knowing that you have no rule of law, you have no procedures. You just can do anything and get away with it. Why would anybody bring in their investment here when they can go to saner climate, saner economies to invest? So I think that everything we do whatever it is, has to be methodical, has to be procedural, has to continue at all times to exemplify the fact that we respect our own constitution, our own laws. And when we don't do that, the consequences in the long term would be very, very damaging. The question we have to ask is, who is investing in Nigeria? Who from outside Nigeria is investing? Who in Nigeria, a Nigerian, is investing in this climate? Very few people. And we must ask ourselves why this is the case. So the government has to go back to the drawing board, understand what the world is doing to attract investment into it. It has to go back to find out what the world is doing to encourage its own citizens to invest in its own economy. We are not seeing that. Rather, what we are seeing is continuing shutdown of businesses, increasing unemployment, increasing joblessness, and of course, increasing insecurity. And because there's increasing insecurity, it goes back in a circle, and the country continues to go down the drain.
And for Nigeria to have investments, the elections need to be transparent and extremely credible. Now, the INEC chairman, Mahmoud Yakubu, has vowed to solely man the Result Collation Center. Does that put to rest the Amina Zakari opera?
I think that the INEC chairman did explain what the appointment of Commissioner Amina Zakari was, which is really that she was responsible for the logistics of the center. I would have been careful if I was INEC in giving the issues involved how to manage that situation. But there was no doubt at all from the beginning that the INEC chairman is the ultimate in terms of announcing the results of the presidential elections. He's the chief electoral officer for the country. I think that opening up INEC's situation room does answer to a lot of questions that we have been asking. We have been asking that question for a very long time, simply because we know that INEC says it is test running its electronic collation platform. This test run will continue even with this election, even though the Electoral Act was not passed or assented to by the president. But indeed, INEC will continue to test run that process. And what we have said for a very long time is that INEC needs to open up that process so that civil society, even agents of political parties, can see how it gets these results and tally together with that result what INEC eventually announces. That platform, the electronic collation platform.
The role of Nigeria in Gambia elections, and you also mentioned, certain examples. The US and the UK recently threatened to ban anyone who instigates violence and rigs the Nigerian election from entering their countries. The federal government's response is that this is an undue interference. In your opinion, is this undue interference?
Nigeria sent warships to the coasts of Gambia and asked the president to hand over power. We did that in just down the road in Gambia. I think the days when you defined violation of democratic tenets, when you defined concerns by other nations about it, as interference is gone. It's a global village. Everybody is watching what is going on. Everybody has set up, protocols have been set up. Even ECOWAS set up its protocol on good governance and elections, which was the basis on which the president even said he was not going to sign the Electoral Act into place because he said it was too close to the elections as recognized by the ECOWAS protocol. We didn't agree with him on that because there was nothing controversial about the Electoral Act, but clearly Nigeria has used the definitions of international concern about elections to justify its own actions and justify sending warships to the Gambia. So you can't approbate and reprobate, as the lawyers say. You can't blow hot and blow cold in one breath.
Many thanks, Mr. Clement Nwankwo, for being a part of the show this morning. We do appreciate your presence.